Well, at this hour last night, as we were just saying, we learned the dramatic story told in a breaking news report in the New York Times about how Donald Trump was presented with specific evidence of the Russian attack on our election 2 weeks before he was inaugurated. The New York Times reported that on January 6, 2017, President-elect Trump in Trump Tower was shown texts and emails from Russians who engaged in the attack on our election and other highly classified source material showing that President Putin directed and directly ordered this attack. And now this morning, in an interview on CNN, we learned more from James Clapper, who was then the director of national intelligence and was in the room with the president-elect when that evidence was presented.
I think the best insight into the level of detail and the fidelity of the information we had, which gave us such high confidence, can be found in a careful read of the most recent indictment of the 12 GRU officers by Special Counsel Mueller. That, to me, is, I think, great insight into the detail that we had, which we exposed the president and his team to on the 6th of January of 2017. In addition, we left a very highly classified written document which laid out in more detail the evidence that we had. And so the fact that President Putin was directly involved and directly ordered this, no big decisions are made in Russia anyway without Putin, and all that was laid out.
And so Donald Trump has known from the start of his presidency that Vladimir Putin ordered the attack on our election. And from James Clapper this morning, we learned that Robert Mueller has known from the beginning of his investigation about at least some of those Russian military officers who Robert Mueller indicted last week. And that means that Robert Mueller probably could have brought that indictment against those Russians months ago. And so the timing of that indictment on the Friday before the Monday that the president was scheduled to meet with Vladimir Putin now seems all the more calculated and deliberate, and shows that in addition to the investigative skills that Robert Mueller and his team have, the Mueller team is also in possession of masterful tactical, strategic skills. The strategic timing of that indictment meant that the indictment was the lens through which the news media and the world watched the catastrophe that was the Trump-Putin summit. Donald Trump has a pattern. After he makes a disastrous mistake, which leads to worldwide public humiliation, Donald Trump, and Donald Trump alone, believes that he can prove that it wasn't a mistake by publicly announcing he's going to make exactly the same mistake again. And so President Trump did that again today. And he did it when the cable news world was riveted to an interview that the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, was giving to Andrea Mitchell here on MSNBC. The interview was deemed so important by other cable news networks that they actually simulcast part of this MSNBC interview at the Aspen Security Forum. It was an extraordinary television event because, of course, Donald Trump has just this week equated Dan Coats and Vladimir Putin.
My people came to me, Dan Coats came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be.
And so, as expected, Andrea's interview with Dan Coats today began very badly for the President of the United States.
Moments after the president appeared to be siding with Vladimir Putin over you personally, by name, you stood up and spoke out. I'm wondering, why did you do that?
I'm not surprised we're starting with Russia. I was just doing my job.
I'm wondering, when you watched that in Helsinki, what was your gut reaction watching him validate Vladimir Putin's assessment over yours?
Well, my thoughts there were that I believed I needed to correct the record for that, and that this is the job I signed up for, and that was my responsibility. Obviously, I wished he had made a different statement, but I think that now that has been clarified based on his late reactions to this. And so I don't think I want to go any further than that.
And Donald Trump certainly didn't want him to go any further on that. And so, with the news world riveted to Andrea Mitchell's interview with Dan Coats, Donald Trump decided to shake things up by having his press secretary tweet an announcement that, in Donald Trump's mind and in his mind alone, proves that his one-on-one summit with Vladimir Putin was not a colossal, disastrous mistake. Watch Dan Coats' reaction when he learned from Andrea that the White House press secretary just tweeted that Donald Trump has invited Vladimir Putin to the White House.
We have some breaking news. The White House has announced on Twitter that Vladimir Putin is coming to the White House in the fall.
Say that again?
Vladimir Putin coming
Did I
to
hear
the...
you? Did I hear you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's going to be special.
Dan Coats had already told Andrea that he has no idea what Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin discussed on Monday. And so obviously Dan Coats has no idea why President Trump is rewarding Vladimir Putin with an invitation to the White House. When Andrea opened up the questioning to others in the room, Carol Lee of NBC News said this.
The White House announcement that Andrea referenced earlier said Putin was invited to Washington this fall. Were you aware of that? Just want to clarify, because you didn't seem to be.
Based on my reaction, I wasn't aware of that.
Well, would you recommend that there not be a one-on-one without note takers?
If I were asked that question, I would look for a different way of doing it.
Congressman Adam Schiff and Eric Swalwell tried to find out what Dan Coats and no one else in the Trump administration seems to know, which is what President Trump and Vladimir Putin talked about when they were alone. Congressman Swalwell will join us in a moment to describe their attempt to get the House Intelligence Committee to subpoena the notes of the State Department interpreter who was in the room with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. The Senate showed how quickly it can actually do something today when the Senate really wants to. It took the Senate's Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer, exactly 3 minutes and 8 seconds to convince the Senate to vote on a resolution, quote, expressing the sense of Congress against the making available of current and former diplomats, officials, and members of the armed forces of the United States for questioning by the government of Vladimir Putin. The Senate vote was 98-0 in favor of that resolution after Donald Trump on Monday publicly said that it was a good idea to hand over, among others, Obama administration ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul, who Vladimir Putin specifically mentioned on Monday as he stood beside Donald Trump. Vladimir Putin accused Ambassador McFaul of being a criminal and said he would trade the extradition of the 12 Russian military officers who have been indicted by Robert Mueller for Ambassador McFaul and other Americans, to which the President of the United States said this.
What he did is an incredible offer. He offered to have the people working on the case come and work with their investigators with respect to the 12 people. I think that's an incredible offer, okay?
When asked about that yesterday, the White House press secretary said that the Trump administration was still considering Vladimir Putin's offer, still considering whether to hand over Ambassador McFaul and other Americans to Vladimir Putin. A State Department spokesperson yesterday immediately said that that was ridiculous and that the State Department would never participate in such a deal. And then the United States Senate voted unanimously today to condemn the idea. And so the most incompetent, bumbling White House staff in history and the most incoherent and weakest president in history once again completely backed down on what Donald Trump called an incredible offer from Vladimir Putin. Joining us now, Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell from California, who's a member of the House Intelligence and Judiciary Committees, and Nicholas Burns, former ambassador to NATO and former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs for President George W. Bush. And Ambassador Burns, I just want to go to you first on what Donald Trump called an incredible offer. This cooperating with Vladimir Putin, and how Vladimir Putin wants to investigate, among others, Ambassador McFaul, possibly have him arrested, extradited to Moscow for trial.
It was such an outrageous offer from Vladimir Putin. You have to wonder, Lawrence, why didn't Donald Trump just turn it down on the spot? I think all of us who are watching that extraordinary press conference from Helsinki thought this sounds like the worst deal that the United States could ever agree to. It took President Trump 4 days. Can you imagine the United States turning over David Kramer, Michael McFaul, outstanding public servants, to Russian intelligence agents? You can't imagine it, because we've never had a president so cynical and so ignorant of what's right and what's wrong. And you see this huge chasm between the president and everybody else in the government. You can't believe that Jim Mattis or Mike Pompeo or even John Bolton thought this was a good idea, but the president apparently did until today, when his hand was forced by that 98-0 vote.
Ambassador, with your experience in the White House, tell us what you would expect to happen in a White House. It's inconceivable that a president could say something like that, other than Donald Trump. But let's assume some other president said something that you really want to take back, that an offer made by Vladimir Putin or some other head of state sounded like a really good deal. The president says that in public. Everyone in the administration knows it's not a good deal. Here's what's wrong with it. Describe for us what would be the scene on Air Force One, the scene back at the White House, working on the problem that has just been created. And would it take any other White House more than half the week to come out with a statement saying, no, we're not going to do that?
Well, first, you can't imagine any American president in our lifetime who would think about taking that offer for a second. But hypothetically, you have to speak truth to power. And in a normal White House with a normal, rational president who put the country's interests first rather than his interests first, you'd have a conversation where you'd say, you cannot accept this, and we have to strike this down, and announce that we're striking it down immediately. And you'd send the White House spokesperson out or the national security advisor out to say something like, you know, the president must have misunderstood this proposal, or it wasn't communicated properly, but we're not going to do it. To take 4 days and to let honorable people like Mike McFaul and others have to wonder if their government was going to stand up for them. Think about the message to our NATO allies. I mean, here we've had this extraordinary week where Trump is treating Putin significantly better, with more respect than Angela Merkel or Theresa May, where he calls the EU a foe of the United States, but treats Putin to a second meeting this autumn. He has an upside-down foreign policy, and it has no basis of morality or common sense or strategy that could possibly help the United States to succeed in the world.
Congressman Swalwell, tell us about your effort to subpoena the interpreter's notes.
Well, good evening, Lawrence and Ambassador. Lawrence, we had an open hearing in the Intelligence Committee today. Very rare that we do that, and it just happened to be by accident the same week where the president had this one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin. And because the president is a former prosecutor, I'll just say he has priors. He has disclosed national security information in the past to Russians in private, because there's suspicion that he was executing secret deals by wanting to turn over Ambassador McFaul. There's a high concern that we want to know what he has exposed us to or what he has told them. So we asked the Republicans, so many of them on this committee, by the way, they put out tweets over the past couple days of concern. We wanted to see if they were serious. And so Ranking Member Schiff and I put a motion forward during our hearing to subpoena the translator and bring that person in a closed hearing so we could just learn what national security deals are at risk and what secrets have been exposed. They voted it down along party lines, Lawrence, which shows me that they are not quite there yet as to wanting to protect our country over this president.
And Senator Jeff Flake has said he's wondering whether you should get the interpreter's notes. The unprecedented nature of the request, and even the request for the subpoena, is what has slowed down a lot of Republican senators. That's what they're citing. But this is, I think you would make the case, an unprecedented situation. It's not like you and Congressman Schiff are constantly asking for interpreter's notes.
That's right, Lawrence. And we gave careful consideration of this, and that's why we asked for it to be first, in a closed session, so there was no spectacle of a public hearing. But again, the president has demonstrated time and time again that he should not be given the courtesy of precedent because he acts in such extraordinary ways. And to see today that the lesson that he has taken away from the way he acted and the way the American people have themselves reacted to his meeting with Vladimir Putin, to invite him back to the White House shows that he either has missed the message or doesn't care. Lawrence, Vladimir Putin attacked America. When your house is broken into, you upgrade your home security system. You don't invite the burglar over for dinner. So all we can do now in Congress is to make sure that we upgrade the security system. And that includes right now protecting the United States against our own president and his relationship with Vladimir Putin.
Senator Chuck Schumer said today, until we know what happened at that 2-hour meeting in Helsinki, the president should have no more one-on-one interactions with Putin in the United States, in Russia, or anywhere else. Ambassador Burns, your reaction to that?
Oh, I think it's just common sense. You always want to have a record of what our guy or gal says and what the other person says. You always have the National Security Advisor or a White House staffer in the room. You don't want the Russians to come back, which they will, to say that President Trump promised this or that. Even if he didn't promise it, you want to be able to defend yourself, and they've really left themselves exposed here, the White House. And you got to hope that the president will find some common sense if he does have another meeting, which I think is extremely ill-advised anyway, to invite our most dangerous adversary to Washington, D.C., a visit of honor. He should be inviting Angela Merkel, Theresa May, the European leadership, and put NATO back together after his wrecking ball tour of Europe.
Ambassador Burns, a quick one before you go. Dan Coates said today he suspects it to be likely that the Russians at least tried to record that meeting, or very likely they do have a recording of that meeting. Do you agree with that in your experience?
Yeah, diplomatic practice is that you don't record meetings, but the Russians, I think, have a practice of violating most understanding. So Dan Coates is a man of great principle and honor, and I think he's probably right.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.